With the plywood hung on all the walls, we could move on to installing the trim throughout the shop. Ray and Jono from the Perkins crew were on hand to help with some of the trim work, and we started by trimming out the work platform. Unfortunately, with the block walls being so bowed, we had to use 2x4 trim on this back wall to cover the gap between the subfloor and the wall. Thankfully, we could use 1x4 trim on the other two walls, and this was all material I salvaged when I moved out of the old shop. Where the platform stepped down to the slab, I transitioned to using some leftover PVC trim from the not-so-tiny house build. And PVC is pretty ideal here since it's impervious to moisture, but even with that, we still gapped the baseboard up off the slab by about ½ inch, just for good measure. We continued with the PVC trim on the other walls of the shop, leaving that same ½ inch gap there as well. We also added a vertical piece of trim where the plywood met the concrete block wall at the end of this run, and the plywood was held back here to keep it from contacting the exterior block wall. The CNC room got more of the PVC trim, and as you might notice, we were using both finish nails and trim head screws here. And we needed to add screws as we could only nail the top edge of the trim where they met the studs, since we had added those joist hangers to all of these exterior walls earlier in the build. And these short trim head screws would grab anywhere on the plywood, even between the studs, which is a major bonus of plywood walls. When splicing two pieces of trim, we cut a 31.6 degree miter at the end of the piece, and the number didn't really matter here as long as the angles were the same, but 31.6 degrees is a common setting on most miter saws. I also left a small gap for caulking the joints later, and the gap just gives the caulk somewhere to go. Once the baseboards were on, we worked on some of the outside and inside corners, starting with this outside corner by the CNC room. And we just used two pieces of 1x4 here, nailing them in place. For the inside corners, we were able to use some of the French cleat trim from the old shop. And this trim was used at the old shop to cover the seams between the two rows of plywood, but it won't be needed here since we'll be filling any seams and then painting the plywood. We pre-assembled the corner boards, nailing them together, and then nailed them in place in the corners. And this really helped to account for any out of squareness, which most of these corners ended up being, and any small gaps will be caulked prior to paint. We repeated the process on the inside corners outside the dust collection closet and then on the work platform. And I found my narrow crown stapler was perfect for assembling these inside corners, as I could use shorter staples, which reduced the chance of them curving out through the face of the trim. The last corner to deal with was this funky outside corner outside the spray room. And the block above this steel I-beam had kind of been broken at some point in the building's history, and I figured I could pretty easily cover it up since it didn't really serve any structural purpose. I started by adding one face of the corner trim, and I also added a temporary 2x4 to make sure this board aligned with the other trim piece to be installed. I nailed the board in place and removed the 2x4, then I could add the second trim board. And this board went all the way to the ceiling, kind of boxing in the end of the I-beam, which would allow me to trim it out later on. With that trim piece in place, I could fill in the last piece of plywood on the wall to close that up, and then I could repeat the process around the corner to cover up the broken block. And this ended up working great, and will also give me a better surface to attach the drop ceiling board or two later on. Once that was done, I could turn my attention to trimming out the door opening to the CNC room. I decided to keep it super simple and just use some scrap maple plywood for my jambs, since my door hinges will attach through the face of the walls, not to the jambs. I nailed the jambs on all three sides of the door opening, and then before adding the trim, I needed to cut away the excess baseboard where we had left it long previously. And this was easy with an oscillating multi-tool, and I like using a straight piece of scrap as a guide when making these kinds of cuts. I added the door trim afterwards using a mix of PVC and wood, and with that, the trim was pretty much done. So as I'm sure you'll remember, I ended up having some pretty nasty mold growth in the shop, and before painting, I wanted to get the mold remediation work done so the mold didn't get trapped behind the paint. Thankfully, the timing worked out great, as the guys from Pure Maintenance were able to come out the following week. Between the initial consultation and when they came to treat the mold, I had done a few things to help reduce the mold growth. First, I got the mini split units installed, which really helped to keep the temperature and humidity levels down in the shop. Second, I got this monster of a dehumidifier, the Alarair Storm Elite, up and running in the shop, and this dehumidifier has really helped keep the humidity down in the space, usually keeping it around 50% relative humidity, which is a huge improvement over the close to 80% I was seeing previously. This unit has a built-in pump so it can empty itself into my shop sink, and it's also Wi-Fi enabled so I can control the dehumidifier through Allurair's app. The unit is rated for 3,000 square feet, which is pretty much exactly what I needed for this shop space, and it seems to have no problem running around the clock since it's a commercial unit. And I'll link to it in the video description in case you're interested. Before the mold remediation guys came to fog the building, I needed to spread some things out in the shop to make sure the fog hit every surface. And by far the most cramped area in the shop was the spray room, which I've been treating as kind of a storage unit, and so I spent some time unpacking it. Unfortunately, I also unearthed a ton more mold growth in this room, which makes sense as it's been closed off from the rest of the space. Once again, plywood and sheet goods seem to be the worst impacted by the mold, as you can see from the mold growth on a lot of my shop furniture. Luckily, after the fogging process, all of this mold should be biologically dead, so I can clean off everything and salvage it from ending up in the dumpster. Speaking of which, the mold remediation crew showed up shortly after unpacking the spray room and started getting set up for fogging. The first step of the process was to partition off the various spaces throughout the shop, and this fog has to reach a certain level of concentration to be effective, and by partitioning my fairly massive shop space, they can reach that concentration more quickly. Overall, they subdivided the shop into 5 sections, 3 sections in the main shop space and then the spray room and addition. Once that was done, they got the sanitizer mixed up, diluting it, and then loading up their fogger, which is a proprietary system, hence why I'm blurring it out here. As you can see, the sanitizer is safe for skin contact in its diluted form, and Shade, one of the mold remediation crew members, was making sure the fog was sufficiently dry here, as the last thing they wanted to do was introduce excess moisture to an already moldy environment. Next, Shade placed these indicator strips around the first area to be fogged, the office and kitchen area. And these strips will turn black when they come into contact with the fog, and these just help to ensure the entire space is fogged properly. Once the strips were set up, the fogging process could start, with Shade setting up the foggers in the space and letting them run until the correct concentration was achieved. And as you can see, the air starts out essentially opaque with the fog, and at that point the fog goes through a phase change, turning to a gas and becomes clear, which allows it to flow into every nook and cranny in the space. And at that point the fog needs to sit in the space for about an hour to do its work. While that happened, Shade can continue fogging the rest of the space with the addition up next. And as you can see, I desperately need to get some organization going here, and that'll be an upcoming video. Next up was the spray room, which obviously really needed the fogging. Once the spray room was done, he moved into the main shop area, which again was divided into 3 spaces. Also, in case you're wondering, the fog does not damage cast iron or other surfaces, which definitely isn't true about the mold spray I had used previously. The only thing this fog will affect is brass, and it'll just discolor it. Shade also made sure to fog the mini-split units and the dehumidifier, since there were likely mold spores in both of those units. The same goes for my central AC system in the office space, and we ran the fan on the unit to pull the fog into the ductwork and air handler. Finally, he fogged the last section of the shop area, and that was a wrap for the first floor. Once the fog had settled, he set up an air scrubber in the space to capture any airborne mold spores in the shop and let that run overnight. The following day, Shade came back to apply the mold inhibitor, which is also applied with the fogger. And this inhibitor bonds to the surfaces in the shop and will help to prevent any future mold outbreaks. The last step in the process was a mold viability test, which essentially checks to ensure the mold was actually biologically dead, and Shade came back to take samples a few days later. Thankfully, the results confirmed the mold was in fact dead, RIP, so I can clean up the mold from the surfaces around the shop as I get to them. So it is a huge relief to have that mold remediation work done. I am super happy to have that behind me. The other thing I want to talk about real quick is something that I've gotten a ton of comments on. And that is the drainage, or the issue of the water getting in, especially through that right wall in the shop. And I am happy to report that since having the gutters cleaned about a month or so ago, I have had 0 water getting in, which is amazing. It seems like the gutters were just filthy, chock full of dirt and debris, and they were basically just overflowing every time it rained. So I think that was obviously a big part of this mold issue, was just all that excess humidity. That being said, I do have a big porch project that I'm going to be building on the front of
of this shop coming up in the next week or so. Going to be renting an excavator to dig the footings for that. And while I have it, I'm going to go ahead and do a bunch of drainage work outside. So you guys can stay tuned for that. I've also kind of been putting it off because, you know, it was the middle of summer here and I didn't really want to be doing that in 90-degree weather. And now fall is pretty much here in Western North Carolina. So anyway, with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and get started on the paint prep.
With the mold remediation done, we could finally get to work prepping the walls and trim for paint. And this was a pretty massive undertaking as I wanted these plywood walls to look as nice as they could. We started by filling all the screw holes and seams with spackling, and this Ready Patch compound seemed to work great on this plywood. It dried super hard and sanded really well. After spackling, we sanded the walls, making sure to sand down any excess spackling. And I got a drywall sander to try on this, but it wasn't really aggressive enough on this plywood since there was a pretty decent amount of material to remove. Instead, a corded random orbit sander, and in particular my Festool Rotex, worked great to take down any unevenness in the seams. After sanding, I got to work caulking all the seams between the trim and walls, which was a lot of work considering the sheer amount of trim there was to caulk. This caulking was particularly important inside and outside of the CNC room and dust collection closet, as I really wanted to air seal those rooms as much as possible for soundproofing. The last bit of paint prep work was filling in the plywood around the steel I-beams which run through the shop. I filled these openings in using the same method as the outlet box holes, first attaching a piece of backer plywood inside the wall. Next, I cut and fit pieces to fill in the area using a sander to match the curve on the beam. And I mainly focused on the bottom half of the pieces since the top half will be covered by the drop ceiling later on. Once the filler pieces were installed, I could spackle around them, but first I vacuumed off the insane amount of dust left over from when this building was a cabinet shop. I added the spackle, filling in the screw holes in any large gaps, and left it to dry for a few hours. Once it was dry, I sanded down the excess spackle and then caulked the seams to smooth things out even more. And here's the final look after painting, and I think this method worked great. And with that, the paint prep was done. So obviously next on the to-do list after doing all the paint prep was the painting work, and as you can see, I've gotten started on that. I've sprayed 15 gallons of paint already, which is insane, and I am 2 coats in. So I'm gonna be covering all of that work in next week's video, so go ahead and get subscribed and ring the notification bell. If you guys wanna catch up on this whole series, I'll link to the playlist here on the screen. I'll also have links to all the tools and materials I use down in the video description below. And last, if you wanna support me, I sell merch. I have plans available for a lot of my woodworking projects, and I have both Patreon and YouTube members. All right, thanks for watching, y'all, and until next week, happy building.